Electric kiln basics. In this video we're going to talk about the anatomy of a standard barrel style scut kiln, as well as how to operate the basic functions. The first thing you'll notice is that I don't have enough work yet to fire this kiln, so always try to fill your kiln so you're not wasting energy. The work in an electric kiln is done by these kiln elements, the metal coils of wire that electricity passes through to create heat. This is similar to the process that happens inside of a toaster or an electric oven. The walls of the kiln are made of soft brick, which is an insulating material, but it's also quite fragile. So you can see here there's wear and tear on the upper edge of this brick where people have bumped into it as they're loading the kiln. So always be really cognizant of the fragile walls of an electric kiln. You can see here this is a peep, and peeps are used to plug up the spy ports on the side of the kiln. The spy ports are useful for venting the kiln, either to cool it faster or to allow moisture to escape when you're preheating. Now this kiln has two firing modes. This is the manual firing mode, where there's simply a dial with low, medium, high, and off on each of the three kiln rings. You may encounter an older kiln that is only operated based on these three settings of low, medium, high in combination with the Kiln Sitter. In this case, the Kiln Sitter is what will determine when the kiln stops firing. If you have a kiln with a computer or controller, you will have a pyrometer. This is a high temperature thermometer which has a probe that is actually inside the kiln measuring the current temperature, usually for a digital output. So this is what the computer will use to determine when to stop the firing. And like I said, this kiln has both a computer and a Kiln Sitter, so we have two modes of controlling the firing temperature. Now the kiln computer or kiln controller is a very standard option on most modern kilns. It will allow you to more accurately control the temperature of the firing at different points. Now before beginning any firing, it's important to remove any flammable material from around the kiln area. You want at least 18 inches between any firing kiln and flammable materials. So I'm going to unplug excess cables and remove any flammable material. I do have some non-flammable materials like kiln shelves stored behind this, but those will not be affected by the temperature. Now when closing a kiln lid, the kiln is propped on that metal arm. It's important to check visually that none of the work is protruding up beyond the wall of the kiln, which could be cracked by lowering the lid. On a new kiln, you should be able to latch the lid closed with the locking mechanism, though sometimes the heat will warp those mechanisms. So now I'm going to just inspect around the kiln to make sure there's no flammable material, nothing touching the kiln, and if I had enough peeps I would make sure that those are all in place. And now I'm going to work on the Kiln Sitter. Now the Kiln Sitter is a tried and true analog method for shutting off the kiln once it reaches peak temperature. On the left hand side we have a timer dial, and so this is similar to an electric oven. It will just shut the kiln off when that timer runs out. On the right hand side we have a top lever catch, we have a white power button, and then we have this weighted latch. So the white button is really the on and off switch, but this weighted latch, when it's held in place by the upper catch, will allow the white button to stay in on position, pressed in. However, when that latch is lifted, it automatically pops the white button out, shutting the kiln off. So either the timer or the latch will shut the kiln off at the proper time. If we look inside the kiln, we can see the cone setter. So there's a cone, a pyrometric cone. In this case I'm using a stick because I don't have the proper cone. But if you have the proper cone, you'll place it in the three jaws of the cone sitter. And when that cone melts, it will allow that lever mechanism to drop, which will automatically turn the kiln off. So in that way, the kiln will not fire hotter than the melting temperature of the proper cone. When the cone is in place, you can press the white button and the kiln will activate and turn on and be operated based on the low, medium, high settings on the dials. Now, if you're firing the kiln based on the computer, we have a lot more options. The computer is standard on most modern kilns, and we have both a cone fire mode and a ramp hold mode. The cone fire mode is very simple. Simply press the cone fire mode and then select which pyrometric cone temperature you would like to fire the kiln to. In this case, I'm doing a bisque to cone 04. And then just select the speed at which you'd like to fire. I generally choose slow because even the slow speed of these presets is still quite fast. Now, one super important point about the cone fire mode is that it will prompt you for a hold time at the end of your programming cycle. And the hold time is actually the time that the kiln will hold at the peak temperature. If you enter 1 hour here, it will fire up to the maximum temperature and then maintain that maximum temperature for an hour. That could cause significant glaze runs and damage to the kiln furniture. So typically we don't do any hold time at all, and it's best to just avoid this function unless you have a specific reason. Now, some people get confused between the hold time and the delay time. The delay time is indicated by this button on the left-hand side, and that will tell the kiln to wait a certain amount of time before it begins the firing cycle. So if you program your kiln in the morning, but you don't want it to start the cycle until the evening, you could add a 12-hour delay by pressing the button on the left and entering 12.00. This is useful because you would like to be in the area of the kiln when it's supposed to reach maximum temperature. That way, if there's a malfunction for some reason, you'll be there to turn the kiln off manually and just assess the situation before any fires break out or some other damage occurs. So you always want to check the kiln and be in the area of the kiln when it's firing, especially as it's reaching peak temperature. This goes for every kiln, even if you have a kiln computer and a cone sitter. If you're satisfied with the settings, then you can just go ahead and press start and the kiln will fire. If you want more control over your firing, use the ramp hold mode. The ramp hold mode operates on segments. And so I'm going to use 5 segments, and in each segment I'm going to program the ramp, so the degrees Fahrenheit per hour that the kiln will change temperature, so 100 degrees an hour, and then the target temperature of that segment. So I'm going to go 100 degrees an hour until 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm going to hold at 200 degrees Fahrenheit for 8 hours. That will allow the moisture to evaporate without boiling or cracking the work. Then I will proceed through all of the segments, entering the ramp temperature and the target temperature and the hold time for each of those segments. This is a little bit more specific and advanced than the cone fire mode, but certain glazes and clays require specialty firing times and temperatures. So if you're trying to recreate something that you've read from a recipe or a book, you might need to use the ramp hold mode in order to get the effects that you want. It's also quite useful when firing large or wet work because you have the ability to slow the firing down more than the cone fire mode would allow you. Now, when you've cycled through all of the segments, it will say stop, and then it's always good to review your program. In the ramp hold mode, some of the prompts move quickly and it's easy to get confused. So don't be afraid to just review your program multiple times until you are sure that the cycles are exactly what you'd like. A simple error in the programming could lead to a really expensive mistake. Again, once you're satisfied with the programming, you can hit Start to activate the cycle. You should hear a clicking noise, which indicates electricity is flowing through the heating elements. And if you don't hear it, the first thing I would check is your cone sitter. Make sure that the white button is pressed in and that the manual firing dials are all set to high. The indicator light will tell you that electricity is flowing through the elements. Once the kiln is firing, never reach inside of it because touching the heating elements while electricity is flowing is quite dangerous. So don't risk that by reaching in. If you need to rearrange your stack, just simply stop the program and you can restart it without having to re-enter the program as long as you don't make any changes. So once the kiln is firing and the lid is closed, take one last look around the area to make sure things are safe and then enjoy your firing.